Hello everybody, thanks for coming out. It's good to see you all. We're going to do a little bit of time traveling today, but before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my background. So I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I graduated, just to date me, I graduated in 1969 from high school. And during high school, I really loved science and math. And so I was thinking, well, what should I major in? And it turns out that University of Wisconsin in Madison was the best school in chemical engineering. So I thought, great, I'll go to Madison and major in chemical engineering. Well, my life took a little bit of a detour. Those who know what was happening at the time, it was the height of the 60s, literally the height of the 60s. Demonstrations against the war and racism and about every issue you can think of. And long story short, within 2 semesters, I had joined the Students for Democratic Society, become a Marxist, was a radical activist, and dropped out of college. Changed the course of my life. If it hadn't been for that time, I might be working for Exxon right now. So let's fast forward. It's 2010. I'm working as the executive director of the U.S. Green Building Council. If folks familiar with the Green Building Council? Yeah, they're the folks who do the LEED certification, L-E-E-D, of buildings. If you ever go downtown, you see a lot of those plaques, LEED Gold, LEED Silver. That means they're energy efficient and save water and have healthy materials. It's a really great organization. It's a really important issue. We're the folks who brought you toilets that takes 15 times to flush. So I was the executive director of the Northern California chapter, and we used to do an annual event around in the late fall around Halloween called Green Building Superheroes. And it was a fun event. We always timed it near Halloween, and we encouraged people to come in costume, and it was usually very well attended, very fun. We gave awards to people like Van Jones and Paul Hawken and a lot of other folks. And in 2010, we were having one, and it was also at the time when there was a proposition on the ballot, Prop 23. And Prop 23 would have repealed California's climate change law, which was at the time the most important piece of legislation and policy on climate change in the country. And it turns out that we were very involved in that, along with many other folks, and I was trying to think of who could we get as a big name to come to our event to attract people. And it turns out that the co-chairs of the No on 23 campaign were Tom Steyer and George Shultz. And people know who George Shultz is. Yeah, right. He was a cabinet secretary, 2 cabinet positions in the Nixon administration, and also was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State for 8 years. So he's kind of a Republican icon. And it turns out, so he's the co-chair of the campaign, and one of my staff people, she told me, you know what, I grew up with his granddaughter. I could talk to her and see if maybe we could get a meeting with him and ask if he would come and speak at our event. So I said, great. So we went down to Stanford to the Hoover Institute. We met with Mr. Schultz, yes, you do call him Mr. Schultz. Talked to him, told him about the event, asked him, would you like to speak to several hundred people in the building industry about Proposition 23. And we had a lovely visit. We go into his office, there's pictures of Gorbachev and all these other people around. And a couple weeks later, he calls back and he says, yeah, he'll join us. So it's like, wow, great. We got a big name. So I sent out the announcement by email, and I get a lot of emails back objecting to having George Shultz at our event. And in particular, there was one that came from an architect. It was a very kind of thoughtful, well-argued email making the case against George Shultz. I actually countered that I felt we needed Republicans to kind of come on board for climate change. And so it was rather interesting. So why was this such a big issue for folks? Well, let's do a little time travel again. We're going to go back to the 1980s. So in the 1980s, George Shultz was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. And people may remember or know about what was going on at the time. The United States was involved in supporting with money, intelligence, weapons, training, the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala. And in those two countries, there was a war being waged against the people of those countries by the governments and by death squads allied with the governments. The UN estimates that there were a total of about 315,000 people killed or disappeared in Guatemala and El Salvador. 315,000 people killed or disappeared with the active support and cooperation of the United States government when George Shultz was Secretary of State. You may also remember the Iran-Contra scandal in the late 80s. That's when the Reagan administration secretly traded hostages in Iran for funding for missiles and weapons that they channeled to the Contras in Nicaragua, who were fighting actively to overthrow a democratically elected government in Nicaragua. So that's why some people were upset about George Shultz. So what was I doing in the 80s? Well, actually, I was still quite active politically. I was working for the Vanguard Public Foundation at the time. Folks remember Vanguard? Yeah. So I was raising money, and I raised money, and we funded many organizations that were opposed to our involvement in Central America. So I was very actively involved in that movement, and it was personal for me. So there was a sanctuary movement at the time, a network of churches that provided sanctuary to people who were fleeing the violence in El Salvador and Guatemala. And I signed up, and a family from El Salvador came and stayed at my home for about a month or two. Lovely family. The mother and daughter, they would insist on doing all the cleaning and cooking in my house. I never was treated so well. The father would go off, he would go and be a day laborer. And if anybody remembers, over on Mission and Cesar Chavez, there used to be a paint store, and all the day laborers were there, and he used to go there. And also, I was during the war in El Salvador. The guerrillas did a kind of an offensive, and the government came down very, very hard, and they actually arrested and were imprisoned and was torturing the founder and the director of the University of El Salvador School of Art. His name is Isais Mata. And my colleague knows him, and he was very well known actually in the international art community. So she got involved in a campaign to help free him, and I worked with her on that, and we got people like Mayor Arvagnos at the time to send wires, and mayors of other cities, and there were people in Japan and Italy and all over the world. We did a whole campaign to free him, because what was happening to him is he was not a guerrilla. He was, against the government, but they captured him and they tortured him. And they tortured him by tying him up to a chair. They put a bag over his head with lime in it and then beat him. It was horrendous. So the campaign worked. He was freed. He came up to the United States. And he came to San Francisco, actually. And so he did a piece of artwork for us at Vanguard that we used as a kind of a donor acknowledgement. It was 100 assigned editions of a print, very intense print of a woman holding a dove with a fierce kind of red slash across it. And this was his kind of piece about wanting peace. And I have a signed copy on my wall in our living room. So I also, at the 10th anniversary of the Nicaraguan Revolution, I happened to be down in Costa Rica, and I went over and was there for the 10th anniversary. I was one of those people used to call Sandinistas. A lot of people came from all over the world to celebrate the Sandinista revolution, which the Reagan administration had been trying to overthrow with the Contras. And, it was quite a scene. It was very interesting, and there was all this, slogans everywhere. El future es luminous. And Daniel Ortega was the president. He was a great hero at the time. So I was involved in a lot of stuff. So let's fast forward, come back to 2010. So it's late October, a few nights before the election, and we're having our green building superheroes at the California Academy of Sciences. Fabulous place, beautiful spot, hundreds of people in costume. George Schultz arrives with his wife, Charlotte Maillard, who you may or may not know is the queen of protocol for the city of San Francisco. And she told me when they arrived that they had just come from a 2-day symposium at Hoover Institute in honor of his 90th birthday. After it ended it was Thursday and Friday, and at the end, Friday afternoon, he went and spoke at a campaign event in Palo Alto. Then they came to San Francisco. He spoke at another event in San Francisco. Then he came to our event around 7 or 8 o'clock, and he's going to another event afterwards to speak at another campaign event. And I was like, wow, that's pretty good. 90-year-old guy, doing all that. All to stop the repeal of a climate change law. So I told that story when I introduced him on the stage, and Charlotte from the front row called out, "And we're going to the disco afterwards." I was like, wow, these people, they're fun. So he gave a speech, and it was very good. And he had the whole crowd standing up, and he led a chant. The slogan of that campaign was "No to dirty oil." So it was like, no to dirty oil, no to dirty oil, no to dirty oil, no to dirty oil. And I was like, wow, this is the same guy who worked for Ronald Reagan and had been a mentor for George W. Bush. So it was a great evening. A year later, I get a call from the Hoover Institute. Or no, a couple of weeks later, I get a call. "Hey, Mr. Schultz would like you to come down to present to his think tank about green building. He's got an energy institute there." So I was like, okay, wow, okay, I'll do that. I go down there, look and see who's going to be there. It's like Condoleezza Rice, former director of CIA, this kind of people. So I went down and gave the presentation. It went very well. And Stephen Bechtel was there. People might remember Stephen Bechtel of the Bechtel Corporation. He was about a 90-year-old guy at the time, and he kind of came up to me with his cane. He said, "Oh, that was really great. What's that net zero energy building you were talking about? I want to go see it." A year later, I get a call. I was invited to go and observe a presentation at the Hoover Institute by the Defense Department, where they presented their entire kind of green strategy and how they talked about climate change as a national security issue and a strategic imperative. I was kind of blown away. So, interesting times. Coming back up to date. So, what's happening with so people probably, you all already know, climate change is getting worse and worse and worse. But thank God that we might be getting a major bill. Thank God Joe Manchin and Sinema have maybe been born again. The Vanguard Public Foundation, people remember that well, in around 2011 or so. It went down in flames. It went bankrupt because of a major kind of investment fraud scandal that was like a Bernie Madoff kind of a scheme. And the executive director and the investor guy went to prison, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. The architect who sent the email, well, we became very good friends. We did a lot of great work together on things like green building codes, and also he ended up getting very involved in work around de-incarceration and organized an effort to get the American Institute of Architects to encourage architects to refuse to design prisons and death chambers. And I actually do work in that area as well. Our hero, Daniel Ortega, Well, he lost the election in 1990, but he was reelected again in 2007 and has been president ever since. And a friend of mine who has an organization that works in Nicaragua, he goes down there periodically, he recently told me, basically, Daniel Ortega is like a right-wing dictator. His primary strategy is to suppress the vote of anyone who opposes them using violence, street violence, and thugs. Yeah, he's kind of out-trumping Trump. George Shultz, well, he continued to work on climate change after that. He actually ended up going to Congress and advocating for a carbon tax, and remained pretty active for the rest of his life. And you maybe probably heard he died earlier this year at the age of 100. So, interesting, I've dabbled in a bit of Buddhism, and I've thought a lot about kind of good and evil. And I mostly believe that within each of us we have the potential to be either a Hitler or a Gandhi. And I like a quote by a Zen teacher that I once did a retreat with, and he talked about he says, "What a relief to not have to make ourselves, others, and life fit neatly into some limited idea or framework. Intuitively, we know that all humans are complex and contradictory. Embracing our paradoxes not only provides real insights into ourselves and allows for more self-acceptance, but it also increases our appreciation of everyone else's surprising quirks and contradictions." So, gee, I wonder if that's still true.